You destroy the very thing that could save you. Not once, not by accident, but again and again, with eerie precision, as if guided by some invisible hand that knows exactly where to strike. You meet someone who sees you, truly sees you, and within weeks, you've engineered their exit. You find work that finally aligns with something deeper in you, and you sabotage it before it takes root. You discover a practice that brings you closer to yourself, and you abandon it the moment it starts working. And the strangest part, you watch yourself do it. You see your own hand reaching for the detonator, and you press it anyway. Most people, when they recognize this pattern, spiral into self-judgment. They ask themselves what's wrong with them, why they're so broken, so fundamentally incapable of holding on to good things. They wonder if they're cursed, or worse, if they simply don't deserve the very things they claim to want. They pathologize themselves, creating elaborate explanations for their self-destruction, as if finding the right diagnosis might finally break the cycle. But what if I told you that this isn't a flaw in your psychology? What if this pattern of destruction isn't evidence of damage, but of a profound philosophical awakening happening beneath your conscious awareness? What if you're not destroying what could save you because you're broken, but because some deeper part of you knows that salvation itself is the trap? Let me explain what's actually happening here. For most of your life, you've operated under a fundamental illusion, one so pervasive that questioning it seems absurd. The illusion is this: that there exists somewhere out there in the external world, a person, a circumstance, an achievement, a state of being that will finally complete you. That salvation is a destination you can arrive at, a thing you can acquire, a condition you can achieve. This belief isn't just optimism. It's the organizing principle of your entire existence, the axis around which all your seeking rotates, and for years, maybe decades, this illusion served you. It gave you direction, purpose, something to move toward. The promise of future completion justified present incompleteness. The fantasy of eventual salvation made current suffering bearable. You could endure anything as long as you believed that relief was coming, that wholeness was possible, that somewhere out there was the missing piece that would finally make you feel real. But here's what Heidegger understood with brutal clarity. This entire framework is a flight from being itself. In his terms, you've been living in what he called inauthenticity, a mode of existence where you've handed over the responsibility for your being to external circumstances, to other people, to future possibilities that never quite arrive. You've been waiting for permission to exist fully, waiting for the right conditions, the right person, the right achievement to finally justify your presence here. And in that waiting, you've been absent from your own life. The seeking itself became a way to avoid the terror of presence. As long as you could believe that completion was coming, you didn't have to face the reality of what is. As long as salvation was on the horizon, you didn't have to encounter the profound aloneness at the core of existence. The chase for wholeness became a sophisticated form of self-abandonment, a way to never actually arrive at yourself. Think of it like this: you've been living in a house with all the curtains drawn, navigating by candlelight, believing that somewhere in this darkness is a switch that will flood everything with light. You've spent years searching for this switch, feeling your way through the shadows, convinced that illumination is just a matter of finding the right spot on the wall. You've tried every surface, every corner, growing increasingly desperate, increasingly certain that you're just missing something obvious. And then one day, purely by accident, you brush against a curtain. It moves slightly, and a sliver of daylight cuts through the darkness. And in that moment, you realize something devastating. The house was never dark. You just had all the curtains closed. There was no switch to find. The light was always there, streaming against the fabric you'd carefully hung to keep it out. This is the moment when the destruction begins, because now you know. Now you've seen that the entire framework of your seeking was based on a false premise. There is no external salvation coming. There never was. And this knowing changes everything. Here's what nobody tells you about this realization. It doesn't feel like enlightenment. It feels like death. Because the entire structure of hope you've built your life around just collapsed. All those promises you made to yourself, all those fantasies of future completion, all those beliefs about what would finally make you whole, they disintegrate in an instant. And what's left is raw, unmediated existence with no story to make it bearable. no future to escape into, no salvation to justify the present moment. If you're finding this perspective valuable, if something here is landing deeper than usual content, maybe consider joining the few thousand who go into these depths every single week. You know where the subscribe button lives? This is what happened to you. Somewhere, somehow, you caught a glimpse of this truth. Maybe it was subtle, a momentary crack in the facade during an otherwise ordinary moment. Maybe it was dramatic, a full collapse of meaning during a crisis. But however it arrived, you saw through the illusion of external salvation, and now you can't unsee it. And this is why you destroy the very things that could save you. Because you've realized, at a level deeper than conscious thought, that being saved in the conventional sense would mean going back to sleep. It would mean re-entering the dream of external completion, reinvesting in the fantasy that wholeness comes from outside yourself. Every potential savior, every promising circumstance, every new beginning that looks like it might finally complete you, carries with it the threat of re-enchantment with the very illusion you've started to see through, so you destroy it. Not because you hate yourself, not because you don't deserve good things, but because accepting salvation in the old framework would require you to forget what you now know. It would require you to go back into the house and close the curtains again, to pretend you never saw the light streaming against the fabric. And something in you, something wiser than your conscious mind, refuses. Let me give you an analogy that might make this clearer. Imagine you're a deep-sea creature, evolved for crushing pressure and absolute darkness. Your entire physiology is designed for the depths. Your eyes have adapted to detect the faintest bioluminescence. Your body is built to withstand pressure that would obliterate surface-dwelling creatures. This is your home, your element, the only environment where you make sense. Then, through some series of events, you rise. Maybe slowly, maybe suddenly, but you rise toward the surface. And as you rise, everything that defined your existence begins to fail. The pressure decreases, and your body, no longer compressed by the depths, begins to expand in ways that feel like coming apart. The darkness gives way to gradations of light that your eyes aren't equipped to process. Everything that made you functional in the depths becomes a liability in the shallows. And here's the crucial part. Two creatures still in the depths, your rising looks like dying. They see you losing your form, your coherence, everything that made you recognizably one of them. They don't understand that you're not dying, you're transforming. They don't know that the pressure they think is necessary for existence is actually crushing them. They can't conceive that light might be something other than a threat. But you know now. You've felt the pressure release, you've seen gradations of light that shouldn't exist, and even though the transformation is agony, even though every cell in your body is screaming that this is wrong, that you're dying, that you need to dive back down to where things made sense, you can't. Because you've tasted something that the depths could never offer, the possibility of breathing. This is what's happening when you destroy potential relationships before they stabilize. When you sabotage work opportunities that promise security, when you abandon practices that bring you closer to conventional contentment, you're not self-destructing. You're refusing to dive back down. You're refusing to readapt to the pressure that once felt like home, but now feels like suffocation. Every potential salvation dangles before you the promise of return to the depths, to the familiar crushing weight of seeking external completion, and something in you knows that accepting that salvation would be a deeper death than any destruction you could inflict. Now, most people who recognize this pattern try to fix it. They work harder on their attachment issues, their fear of intimacy, their patterns of self-sabotage. They read books about healing, they go to therapy, they develop elaborate theories about their childhood wounds. And all of this, while potentially valuable, often misses the point entirely, because they're trying to fix something that isn't broken. They're trying to cure themselves of an awakening. They think the goal is to learn how to accept salvation gracefully, to finally let good things stay, to overcome their resistance to being helped. But this approach just reinforces the original illusion. It treats your destruction as a problem to be solved, rather than as an expression of something true trying to break through. It's like trying to cure yourself of rising by learning to love the pressure of the depths. It fundamentally misunderstands what's happening. What you need isn't better strategies for accepting external salvation. What you need is to understand what your destruction is actually in service of, because it is in service of something. Your subconscious isn't mindlessly demolishing your life, it's clearing ground. It's destroying the false scaffolding of external salvation so that something else can emerge. Something that doesn't require saving because it was never lost in the first place. Heidegger called this authentic being toward death. He didn't mean this in a morbid sense. He meant that authentic existence requires you to face the fundamental groundlessness of being, the fact that there's no external foundation, no ultimate savior, no cosmic guarantee. Most people spend their lives fleeing this recognition, constructing elaborate systems of meaning and salvation to avoid the terror of groundlessness. But authentic existence requires you to turn toward it, to encounter it directly, to build your life not on the fantasy of eventual completion, but on the reality of ongoing presence with what is. And this is what your destruction is actually doing. Every time you demolish a potential salvation, you're practicing this turning toward. You're refusing the comfort of false ground. You're choosing the terror of authentic groundlessness over the false security of external completion. It doesn't feel like spiritual practice. It feels like throwing away your only chances at happiness. But that's because you're still measuring it against the old framework. Still judging your destruction by the standards of the very illusion you're trying to escape. Those of you still reading, still tracking this, you already know this isn't entertainment, this is excavation. If you want to keep going this deep, consider subscribing. We do this every week. Let me tell you about someone I knew, someone who embodied this pattern so perfectly, she could have been a case study. She was brilliant, the kind of person who could step into any situation and immediately see what needed to happen. She had this rare combination of insight and capability that made her almost magnetic to opportunities. Jobs pursued her, people wanted to help her, doors opened that remained closed for others, and she destroyed it all. Not dramatically, not obviously, but with surgical precision. She'd get hired for a role that perfectly matched her abilities, and within 3 months, she'd engineer some conflict that made her continued employment untenable. She'd meet someone who genuinely saw her, who wanted nothing from her except to know her. And she'd create distance so efficiently that they'd eventually stop trying. She'd discover a creative practice that brought her alive, and she'd simply stop showing up to it, often right when it started yielding something real. Everyone in her life had theories about why: trauma from her childhood, fear of success, unconscious belief that she didn't deserve good things, and she tried all the prescribed fixes. Years of therapy, countless self-help frameworks. She could articulate her patterns with sophisticated psychological language, could trace their origins, could see them coming from miles away, and still, she destroyed. Then something shifted. Not through healing, not through finally learning to accept help, but through a moment of radical honesty during what should have been another therapeutic breakthrough. Her therapist was walking her through another pattern, another childhood wound that explained another sabotage, and she interrupted. "What if," she said, "I'm not broken? What if I'm destroying these things because they're not actually what I need?" The question hung there, dangerous and true, because it inverted the entire framework. What if her destruction wasn't a symptom of damage, but an expression of wisdom? What if her refusal to accept salvation wasn't pathology, but recognition? What if the very thing everyone was trying to help her overcome was actually the most honest thing about her? She stopped trying to fix herself after that. Not in a giving up way, but in a more profound surrender. She stopped measuring herself against the fantasy of finally being able to accept and keep external sources of completion. She stopped treating her destruction as evidence of brokenness. And in that stopping, something extraordinary happened. She started to discover what her destruction had been making room for. She found that beneath the cycle of seeking and destroying was a capacity for presence that didn't require any external validation or completion. Not as a spiritual concept, but as a lived reality. A way of existing that didn't need to be saved because it wasn't oriented around lack in the first place. Her life didn't become suddenly stable or conventionally successful, but the quality of her engagement with existence fundamentally changed. She stopped waiting for permission to be fully present, stopped outsourcing her sense of groundedness to circumstances and people and achievements. The destruction didn't stop entirely, but its nature changed. It was no longer unconscious sabotage. It was conscious discernment. She could feel the difference between destroying something because it triggered her fear of intimacy and destroying something because it would require her to abandon a hard-won recognition about the nature of existence. The first felt like compulsion. The second felt like integrity. This is you. This is where you are. In the middle of a transformation that looks like destruction because you're still measuring it against the old paradigms. You're not failing to accept salvation. You're awakening to the fact that salvation, as you understood it, was never real. And yes, this is terrifying. Yes, it feels like you're losing your only chances at happiness. Yes, everyone in your life might see you as self-destructive, might offer you increasingly urgent interventions and solutions, but here's what you must understand. You are in a process of transformation that cannot be rushed and cannot be reversed. You've seen through something fundamental, and there's no unseeing it. The old frameworks of salvation and completion and external wholeness, they don't work anymore. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you've evolved past them. You've risen from depths that once felt like home, but would now suffocate you. This doesn't mean you have to be alone. It doesn't mean you can never have relationships or meaningful work or stability. But it does mean that your relationship to these things has to fundamentally change. They can no longer be framed as salvation. They can no longer carry the weight of making you whole. They have to be engaged with from a place of already existing completeness, not from a place of lack-seeking fulfillment. And this is where it gets paradoxical, where it loops back on itself in ways that language struggles to capture, because you can't try to embody already existing completeness. You can't perform groundedness. That just becomes another form of seeking, another project of self-improvement, another way to avoid what is. The recognition of your fundamental completeness isn't something you achieve, it's something you stop obscuring. Think of it like this: you're a wave that spent its entire existence trying to become ocean. You've sought out bigger waves to merge with, deeper waters to dive into, stronger currents to carry you. You've measured yourself against other waves, judged yourself for not being oceanic enough, developed elaborate strategies for becoming more ocean-like, and all of this seeking, all of this striving, was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. You were never not a ocean, you were always ocean. Temporarily expressing as wave, the separation was never real. But here's the thing, you can't think your way into recognizing this. You can't decide to suddenly identify as ocean and have that undo the pattern. Because the mind that's trying to recognize this is itself part of the wave consciousness, part of the illusion of separation. The recognition has to come from somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere prior to thought. And often, it comes through destruction, through the repeated demolishing of every external support, every false salvation, until there's nothing left to cling to except what was always there. You destroy relationships not because you're afraid of intimacy, but because you can feel how they're being framed as rescue. You sabotage opportunities not because you fear success, but because you sense how they're being positioned as the thing that will finally make you legitimate. You abandon practices not because you lack discipline, but because you recognize when they've become another project of self-improvement, another way to avoid being what you already are. If this is resonating at a frequency that most content doesn't reach, maybe it's time to stay. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring these territories where psychology meets philosophy meets lived experience. Now, I must warn you about something. Everything I'm describing sounds like it should feel liberating, like a great weightlifting, like finally coming home to yourself. And maybe, in brief moments, it does, but mostly, it feels like nothing. Or worse, it feels like less. Because your whole system is calibrated for seeking. For the drama of salvation and failure, for the intensity of chasing and destroying, and authentic presence, already existing completeness, groundedness, that doesn't require external validation, it has none of that intensity. It's quiet, it's ordinary, it's remarkably unremarkable. You might think this sounds rather dull, especially compared to the high-stakes drama of your destruction cycles. And I won't lie to you, part of you will miss the intensity. Part of you will long for the days when salvation seemed possible, when destruction felt meaningful, when the whole dance of seeking and sabotaging at least gave you something to do, a role to play, a story to live inside. But here's what that objection misses. The intensity you're nostalgic for was exhausting. The drama of salvation and destruction required you to be constantly vigilant, constantly managing, constantly It demanded that you fragment yourself into the part that seeks and the part that destroys, the part that hopes and the part that demolishes hope. It kept you perpetually at war with yourself, perpetually divided, perpetually unable to rest. What I'm pointing toward isn't duller than that war. It's simpler. It's the difference between the complexity of a locked cage and the simplicity of open space. The cage has intricate mechanisms, fascinating patterns, endless variations to study and understand. The open space has none of that, but one is prison and one is freedom. And once you've tasted freedom, the fascination with the cage's mechanisms starts to seem like a cope, a way to make imprisonment feel meaningful. The life that emerges from this recognition won't look impressive from the outside. It won't generate the kind of stories that make for compelling social media posts or impressive dinner party anecdotes. You won't be able to point to dramatic transformations or before and after moments. But the quality of your existence will shift from constantly seeking ground to standing on ground that was always there. And that shift, while invisible from the outside, changes everything from the inside. This is the deeper reason you destroy what could save you. Not just because you've seen through the illusion of external salvation, but because you're being pulled toward something that doesn't require saving. Something in you knows that the authentic alternative to seeking isn't finding. It's recognizing that you were never lost, and every potential salvation you destroy is another step away from the framework of lostness, another refusal to accept the premise that you need rescuing at all. Heidegger talked about this as thrownness, the recognition that you're always already in existence, always already here, without having chosen it or earned it or achieved it. You are, prior to any story about what you should be or could be or need to be, and most of human activity is a flight from this recognition, an attempt to make our existence feel earned, chosen, justified, legitimate. We seek salvation not because we're actually lost, but because we can't bear the groundlessness of simply being here without reason or purpose or cosmic permission. Your destruction of salvation attempts is a refusal of this flight. It's a turning toward the thrownness, the groundlessness, the simple fact of being here without justification. And yes, this is terrifying. Yes, everything in you wants to run back to the project of earning your existence through achievement or relationship or transformation, but you can't. You've seen too much. You know too much. The game of salvation and seeking has revealed itself as game, and you can't unknow that. So what do you do? How do you live from this recognition? The answer is going to disappoint you. You don't. You can't try to live from this recognition because trying implies you're not already there. Implies there's somewhere to get to, some state to achieve. And that just recreates the whole structure of seeking that got you here in the first place. Instead, what's needed is something more like relaxation. Not the forced relaxation of meditation techniques or breathing exercises, but the natural relaxation that comes from recognizing there's nowhere to go. Every time you feel the pull toward salvation, every time something or someone presents themselves as potentially completing you, just notice. Don't destroy it, don't chase it, just notice the pull itself. Notice the contraction in your chest, the surge of hope, the ancient pattern activating, and in that noticing, there's space. Just a tiny gap between the stimulus and your habitual response. In that gap, you might discover something extraordinary. The pull toward salvation only has power when you're identified with lack, when you believe, at some fundamental level, that you're incomplete and need to become complete. But when you're simply noticing the pull, when you're watching the pattern from just slightly outside it, there's a quality of presence there that isn't lacking anything. That noticing itself, that awareness, it's already whole. It was never not whole. It doesn't need to be saved because it was never in danger. This is what you're actually destroying your way toward, not a new state of being, but a recognition of what's always been the case. You're not becoming enlightened. You're stripping away every belief, every pattern, every potential salvation that obscured your fundamental okayness. You're not building yourself up. You're demolishing everything false until what remains is what was always there. Simple and obvious and completely ordinary. And here's what you need to stop doing. Stop pathologizing your destruction. Stop treating it as evidence of damage. Stop apologizing for it. Stop letting people convince you that your refusal of salvation means you're afraid of happiness. When you destroy what could save you, you're not running from something good. You're running towards something true. You're choosing the terror of authentic groundlessness over the false comfort of external validation. And that choice, however it looks from the outside, is an act of profound integrity. Stop trying to overcome your patterns through understanding them better. You probably understand your patterns brilliantly at this point. You can trace their origins, predict their expressions, articulate their nuances with sophisticated language, but understanding doesn't change the fundamental dynamic. It just makes you a more educated prisoner. What changes things is not understanding the cage better, but recognizing that the cage was always unlocked, that you were always free to walk out. That the whole drama of imprisonment was a story you believed because everyone around you believed it too. Stop comparing yourself to people who seem to have figured out how to accept and maintain stable sources of external happiness. They haven't figured out something you're missing. They're just still asleep to the recognition that's tearing you apart. They're still in the depths, still adapted to the pressure, still believing that salvation is something to be found rather than recognized as unnecessary. You're not failing to achieve what they have. You've evolved past the framework in which their achievements make sense. Stop waiting for the transformation to feel good. It won't, not in the way you think good should feel. There will be moments of profound relief, yes, but they'll be mixed with mourning, with the loss of every fantasy that sustained you, with the death of the person you thought you needed to become. The authentic alternative to seeking doesn't feel like arrival. It feels like stopping. And stopping after a lifetime of movement feels uncomfortably like nothing. But here's the paradox that loops back and redeems everything. Nothing is precisely what you've been looking for all along. Not nothing as in emptiness or void in a negative sense, but nothing as in nothing, as in freedom from the tyranny of needing specific things to be okay. The salvation you've been destroying your way toward isn't a thing to be achieved. It's an absence of the belief that you need to achieve anything. It's the spacious freedom of already being complete, right here, in this moment. Regardless of circumstances or achievements or relationships, you're not destroying what could save you because you're broken. You're destroying it because you're awakening to a kind of salvation that doesn't come from outside yourself. You're developing a relationship with presence, with existence itself, that doesn't require external validation or completion. You're learning, in the most painful way possible, that you were never actually lost.